Tuesday, November 12th. Hello everyone, today I'm going to show you the plants that we grew together in the greenhouse about 3 weeks ago in a video where we had in the title October seed starting. And so from the greenhouse, when we put our seeds in the containers, we brought them inside, and the first step would be for them to sit up here for a couple of reasons. One, we have this heat lamp and heat rises, and it helps radiate the soil, so it keeps the soil warmer. When it gets colder, we'll turn on the heat mat, but for now, there's enough room temperature, ambient room temperature to keep the seeds happy. And in some cases, we'll have this dome that we'll put on top to help with maintaining temperature and humidity. So that's step one. And more importantly, we want to keep the soil off the grow light, especially for seeds that don't require light to germinate. And the reason is we don't want the light to hit the soil and start the algae growth. And algae growth is something that we don't want. So it's best to keep it dark. And once the seed starts to emerge, we'll need to hurry up and get it underneath the grow light. So a couple things, you kind of have to know the days to germination. And with these plants and the seed that we work with, we know that they sprout within 3 days. So around the 3-day mark, I'll keep a closer eye and look for signs like the soil popping up a little bit. So once you start to see the seed emerge, then you place it underneath the grow light. This is a 150 watt light. It's a very powerful light, and about a foot away is the distance we want for emerging seedlings. And then as they get to a certain point, we want them at least 2 feet away for a couple of reasons. One, we want to have the plant chase the light, so it encourages growth in terms of height. And also, we don't want the lamp to burn the leaves. So you'll see here, this is an illustration of when the seeds start to emerge. We want it closer to the light source. And to our right here, we have a traditional grow lamp that is 24 watts. This is something that most people will start with, and this is the lamp that I would recommend that people start with. And you can see here as a good illustration the distance between when the seed first emerges and where the light is. So we want, with this 24 watt light, actually we want to get it to be about 2 inches apart. And we don't want leggy plants. If you get something that the seeds don't have eyes, but they have a way of sensing light. And if they think they're underneath the soil, they'll try to grow longer and to reach the sun. And so if it thinks it's underneath the soil and it keeps doing that, the plants get leggy and they flop over. So here's an illustration of that. Here with the chard, it flops over. But with chard, we can correct it. Some plants, it's tougher to correct, and it's best to start all over again. Plants like brassicas, they get really top heavy, and you're going to have problems later on. So knowing the seed days to germination and making sure they get light to stop that lanky growth is key. And then after they emerge, we want to feed the plants, because from the last video, one of the main principles is to start with a seed starting medium that is very basic. So by basic, there's not a whole lot of things going on in the soil, and that also includes food. You don't want to use amendments, something that's chunky, that is going to create variables that are hard to control for inside. So you want to start with Pro Mix. If you didn't catch that video, we started with Pro Mix, and Pro Mix doesn't contain a lot of nutrients. It's very little. So once they emerge, I like to feed them. So let me bring over this plant here to illustrate. So our first feeding will be just a few drops. So we got this much, and we'll just put it right there directly. And then in about a week, when we next feed it, we're going to feed it more than that. We're going to do a bottom watering. So with this liquid fertilizer, we want to put this into the container and then let the water wick up to about two-thirds, and then we'll take it out. So there is a lot of energy, your energy, work, time placed into getting these seedlings to grow, but that investment is really worth it. When you put it out in the garden, there is less tending to if you start out with really robust plants. It's also why I'm a stay-at-home dad. My kids are 7 and 10 now, and the first few years in their lives, they really need that focused attention, and then later on, you're not having to do more work to kind of like adjust for some of the things that was missed out. So not everybody gets a chance to grow their own plants. Not everyone gets a chance to be a stay-at-home dad. So in those cases, there are other methods that you can use to get your plants to where they need to get to, or your kids to where they need to get to. But anyways, I just wanted to emphasize why there's so much attention placed at the beginning of the seed starting, and it's really a good investment. So this is going to go back underneath here again because it needs that closeness. And then let me bring this plant over. Just a quick illustration of the differences between the wattages of the grow lights. And if you're a beginner, I wouldn't recommend such a expensive piece of equipment. But I wanted to show you, it just basically speeds things along. And then this is not scientific. If we're to do a scientific demonstration, we would need at least 36 plants of each underneath the grow light. But here is a quick illustration of the differences between the size of the plants and the grow lights. So underneath this grow light, we run it for about 12 hours. We expose these plants to 12 hours of light, and it lets them grow in half the time it would take if we were to grow them outside at this time of year, because our day lengths are getting shorter. And so basically we're getting 3 weeks of growth this is 3 weeks of growth. And during this time of year, if we were to do it outside, it would take, I would say, at least twice as long. It would take 6 weeks to get to this stage. So the grow light is super helpful in keeping things consistent for us. We can control a lot of the variables. And by controlling, we basically eliminate the variables like complex soils. And also in here, it's very clean. We don't have to worry about pests and disease. So keep this environment clean and do not introduce contamination. Right now, it's really nice and sunny outside. So there's a really strong temptation. I've done this in the past to take these plants out since I have the time and energy to get it sunlight. But what happens is an aphid would land, and then it would just spread all over the place. Same thing for fungus gnats. You can introduce fungus gnats into here, and it creates a bigger problem. Speaking of fungus gnats, one of the other main reasons for keeping this environment clean with this very basic pro mix is that it reduces fungus gnats. If you were to use some type of amendment that contains maybe a little bit of a wood chunk that's not decomposed, they're going to infest this area. So then you're going to have to deal with fungus gnats. So again, it's really helpful to keep this as basic as possible. And then to make up for that simplicity, we would use a fertilizer. And so the brand I use, since I grow a lot, I don't recommend that you get this because unless you get it in smaller quantities. And I think this is I've probably had this for 2 years now. It's 1.5 pounds. So let me show you how much of it I've used. And I grow a lot of plants. I grow a lot of transplants underneath the grow lights. And I've only used less than a third of this container over 2 years' time. The problem with this is it'll pick up moisture. You start to see it's gotten darker. If I get down a little bit more, it's drier. So it's probably going to be a few inches before I hit the dry stuff. But anyways, you don't want to buy this because if you don't use it up, it can kind of become a problem for you in terms of it getting gloppy and gloopy. and it's also on the more expensive side. So look for a smaller container unless you get to this, when you scale up to this amount of plant growing. There are other alternatives as well, and there other fertilizers. Lowe's has a house brand called Stand Green, and then there is another brand that I'm that a lot of people know about, and I don't want to name it because then it kind of people get emotional about it. So you know what that is, and if you have to use it based on your budget, by all means do it, and you're not gonna get judgment from me about that. But make sure you use it in a very controlled manner. You don't want it. You're just using it to feed the plants, and then beyond that, when they go outside in real soil, it's gonna get it's the roots are gonna get the nutrients and the minerals and all that stuff they need from your soil. But in here, we want to keep things simple and use fertilizers and simple soils. The other thing about this setup that I have is I have this USB fan, and it's uh, on the surge strip that has also the grow light, and then following to the end where the power supply, there's a timer. So when the light is on, the fan can be on. So let me flip it on for you. And it gives a little bit of airflow to this area. And airflow can be important. So I'm going to talk about the next step as far as watering. With experience, when you lift the container, you can tell how much water there is by the weight of it. And what I found super helpful is to allow for the soil here to dry out a little bit. We don't want it to dry out to a point where it's hydrophobic and it shocks the plant. There is still, I would say, maybe 30% moisture in there. That's a rough guess. So by drying out, what happens is when the water evaporates or it gets used by the plant, the space in the container is going to be replaced by air. And with air, you're going to move in oxygen and other things like nitrogen into the root ball. And the root then can kind of get the air. If you have just water, it becomes hydroponics and your root's going to behave differently. So just having it air out is really important. And sometimes a fan can help with some of that surface moisture to just kind of air it out a little bit. That way air can get in. And so when you let it kind of like, I would call air out or dry out, maybe once every few days, you would then bottom water. So whenever you water, you would bottom water, and then you would place it into something like this. And let me give you an example with this guy over here, since it's drying out a little bit. Put it down here like this, and let the water wick up to about 2/3. And with experience, you know when that is, and you want to take it out. And it's okay if it gets all the way 100% saturated. That's not gonna wreck it or anything. But ideally, you don't want it too wet, and that's the best scenario for it. So some of these plants are actually ready to go in terms of transplanting or uppotting. And one of the ways to tell is when you look at the bottom. With experience, you'll know about what size the plants start to get ready to be moved on. So we know for this size, it's getting ready to move on. But in the beginning, when you're trying to build that calibration, you want to look on the bottom. And when you start to see white roots, that's a sign that this plant is ready to be uppotted. So I'm going to set this camera down and see if I can take the plant out of the pot and show you what the root ball looks like. Let's turn this over. And here's the root ball. And this has already gotten a good amount of roots on there. You don't want this whole side to be entirely roots. That's going to be too far along. That's getting close to root binding. And so you want that to be moved along, either uppotted or transplanted. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to play it safe. I'm going to take this out into the garden later on today, and I'm going to up pot it, let into real soil. It's a way to transition the root ball, and then let it grow a little bit more, and then I'm going to finally transplant it into its final spot for it to grow in real soil. So that's what this plant looks like. And I'm just trying to think about a thought that I wanted to share some more about the root balls. Oh, right. So in the greenhouse, I was talking about the container, and more importantly, we don't want our transplant's root ball to contain a lot of this grow medium, which is peat moss. It's got a different soil and hydrophobic quality characteristic than the real soil that we grow in. And so if we were to continue and transplant this, or I should say up pot this into a larger pot and keep it underneath the grow light, we're going to get a larger root ball with this peat moss, and that's not what we want. We want as small as possible. That's why you see us employ something like this 16 cell tray, and when the next time we move it up, this root ball is going to be very small, containing peat. So peat is a great medium for starting plants, but it's not really good for if you're growing it in real soil. So that's one of the keys in life, is that there are pros and cons, and you got to mix the pros and cons together with different environments to get the best possible outcome out of it. So later today, I'm going to be potting some of these things. And then finally, as far as the goals for growing transplants, we want to grow it to a stage where when we transplant, it has a very good survivability rate. And one of the biggest threats for us is going to be the pests like the wood lice or the slugs chewing on the base of the stem. And basically what they do is they girdle the plant, and the way the plants send its nutrients up and down is usually around the cambium. And if they girdle a plant, then the plant will die. So when we get it to a certain thickness, the plant is less susceptible to that. The other thing that is a big threat to our plants would be the critters that dig them up. So that's going to be another thing that we worry about. And usually the larger the plant, the better. But then that's not always the case. So first and foremost, we want to grow it to a size where slugs and bugs aren't gonna chomp them down. So that's why we don't direct sow, and this is why we don't transplant something like this out. This is a seedling that's further along. Let me bring in the other one for you, just kind of so you can get the progression of what it looks like here. Let's bring in this guy back over here. So this is on the right. I would call that emerging seedling. This is seedling. This is a young transplant. I would call this stage 1 transplant. We can up pot it one more time, and I would call that a stage 2 transplant. Since we're going to make up terminologies now, a stage 2 transplant would be a plant that has a good amount of its roots in real soil. So when you put it out, you don't have to worry about it too much. If we were to put this out in our real soil, we'll have to make sure that this root ball is properly hydrated. So we'll have to water at the base where the root ball is, let the water permeate out. If we have a stage 2, we can actually just water wherever the roots are near, and that will be okay. So these are the 3 stages. If we didn't have any bugs that will chomp them down, we can put this out in the garden. But at this time of year, as much of the plant growing underneath the grow light, the better, because then we're speeding things along as far as getting the plant robust enough to handle the outdoors. So I think that's it for now. I think the last thing is this is probably take 5 of this video, and in this take I'm better able to condense my thoughts and get it a little bit shorter. But I'm hoping I didn't leave out something that I said in a previous take in this final take. But I think the one thing I left out was probably just mixing our Maxi fertilizer, and I just used just a little bit like let me get my spoon in there to show you how much I use for this mushroom container amount of water, and it was just this much. But you can follow the directions on the container or the fertilizer that you're using. And I use, again, from the previous greenhouse video, I use reverse osmosis water. And because we bottom water, we want to use water that doesn't contain salt. Here in Southern California, we have our tap water is groundwater. It contains a good amount of salt. And if you bottom water, the salt actually stays in the container and creates problem for the roots. If you were to top water and allow water to leach away and flush out, then you're less likely to have that salt problem. But because of the way peat is and this grow medium is, there's not a lot of perlite. When you water, there's not a lot of that flushing. So we want to use reverse osmosis water or rainwater. And especially in this indoor grow setup, we don't want to do a top water because there's not a lot of place for this to go. And also we don't want to lose our fertilizer it'd be wasted if we just kind of let it flush and get dumped away. So we do a bottom watering to keep all the nutrients in the container. But at the same time, we do that, we want to make sure our water contains very few salts. All right, that's going to be the update for our seedlings. I'm going to be transplanting or uppotting some of these plants now. And I hope you found this video to be useful and have some principles to apply to your grow setup. I'll see you in the next video.